We are in lesson 12 of our series of study that we've been engaged in looking at the life of David and examining how it is that he became a man after God's own heart. And we've been contrasting that in some ways to Saul's conduct and kind of showing the difference between the two kings and the manner in which they led and the manner in which they behaved themselves. I'll be honest with you, this lesson challenged me a little bit because Jeff in his writing of this material, took an angle or an approach towards the situations he's dealing with. And in my own mind, I was wondering whether I would have taken the same direction or the same path that he took. So we'll see. Maybe we'll have a good discussion about this subject of situation ethics. And this particular lesson deals with that scene. If you recall, where had David gone? He went up the Nob, right next door to Door. Anyway, went up the Nob, and who was there? Right, great. And in David's account, or in the account of the Kings here, in 1 Samuel 21, it's Ahimelech. There's an interesting, we had this discussion when we studied the book of Mark, if you remember. In Mark chapter 2, Mark records this event as having happened in the days of Abiathar. Abiathar was the son of Ahimelech. And the general conclusion about that is that you would reference the most remembered priest if you were just looking back to a period of time. And it was Abiathar that actually went and sided with David and against Saul. And so he kind of becomes interconnected to David. And that's maybe why Mark records it as Abiathar there in Mark chapter 2 in those days. But the narrative we're looking at here in 1 Samuel chapter 21 says that it's Ahimelech, the priest. And what's going on with David and his men? They're hungry, right? They haven't eaten for a while. But he knows that if he just flat out asks Ahimelech for help, what's going to happen? Positive or negative result from that? Right. He doesn't figure he'll help him. But if he tells him what? Saul sent me here and he wants you to help me. Then Ahimelech's going to have to make a choice, whether he believes David or not. If he doesn't, and he runs the risk of maybe offending the king, so Ahimelech's got a decision to make. But there's another problem. What is it? We don't have any common, if you will, food that I can give you, David. All I have is the showbread, which is only intended for the priests. But Ahimelech kind of thinks about that and decides that so long as what? Yeah, as long as the men were pure in that sense, as long as the men had been abstaining for, I believe, 7 days, if you go back to the narrative, David assures him of that, right? And I guess it'll be okay. Now, it's an interesting kind of scenario because the law simply was very specific, right? The only ones allowed to have access to that were the priests. And Ahimelech's decision to allow David and his men to eat of that showbread, even according to in Mark's account in Mark chapter 2, in Matthew's account in Matthew chapter 12, Jesus is very specific and said it is not what? Lawful, right? On both, when Jesus refers to this piece of history, his words are, it was not lawful for David and his men to partake of that. Now, there's an extra discussion, particularly in Mark chapter 2, where we get that phrase where Jesus says the Sabbath, man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man. And that's where I struggle a little bit, because Jesus seems, by using this piece of history about the Sabbath, because what were they being accused of? Breaking the law of the Sabbath because they had plucked a few ears of corn while they walked through a field. And that's when Jesus has this discussion with them basically about two things. One is the fact that Jesus is the what over the Sabbath. I'm Lord of the Sabbath. So fellas, you can number one, you can, if you want, you can just take your argument and it's not going to work because Jesus says, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. You can't get any higher in terms of the authority over the Sabbath. So your argument doesn't work from that perspective. And then he adds the idea that it doesn't work from the perspective that there's this misconception among the Jewish population, particularly in the days of Jesus, where they had begun to think that almost like the Sabbath controlled them rather than the Sabbath having been created for their benefit. And he points to David's example of that. And so what we've got to work through today, as now that we've kind of given a quick summary of the history that we're dealing with, is this a matter of situation ethics with David? Or is this an example of maybe even a man after God's own heart is still human, is still imperfect, and still makes mistakes and is challenged, even though his heart desired to follow the will of Jehovah? Is David flawed? Is this so there's kind of a mixed bag here of what is the practical side of this discussion. That's where I took when I said I wasn't sure which path, because I think that's what we need to talk about a little bit today.
I think David sort of persuaded the priest to give him the bread anyway. But I think maybe a little bit of his reasoning for the deception was to protect the priest from Saul.
Yeah. Well, and of course it did the exact opposite. Because they all went up getting slaughtered because of it. But yeah, and I think that, of course, keep in mind, David's a man. David is a good man, and he obviously doesn't want to take by force that which belongs to the priest. But yet he's willing to use this deceptive approach by basically, what would we normally call that? We'd say lie. Okay. We'd say lied. He lied to the priest because Saul never told him to go up there and say those things. And so again, now you got the backdrop. Let's go to the questions like we have been, and let's talk about these things and see what the practical lessons we can extract from these pieces of history that we've kind of summarized for you this morning. So that, as Bob mentioned there a moment ago, let's go into 1 Samuel 21, by the way. That's the narrative. And the question was, why was Ahimelech afraid as David came to visit? So verse 1, then came David to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech was afraid at the meeting of David and said unto him, why art thou alone and no man with thee? And so is this good? Is this bad? What are you doing here? And so Ahimelech has this response. Why do you think he may be afraid?
I just put because David was alone. I didn't know.
Yeah.
It doesn't really say, but it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
He knew David's been a man of war.
Yeah.
Maybe he was coming there to set him up for battle.
Okay. Any other thoughts you might have? I know the text doesn't give you a lot, right? To kind of draw that conclusion. If, in many senses, if David had been on official business, he would have most likely had what? People with him. Okay? And so I'm sure maybe Ahimelech's reservations here are, this doesn't look right. Why is the servant of Saul, why is he here by himself? This doesn't fit the normal procedural things that he might be accustomed to.
He didn't have any weapons with him either. Yeah. Remember, he gets the sword and the last sword.
Yeah.
Last sword and stuff. He said he didn't have anything.
Yeah. So this is a confusing scene, and anytime, and let's think about it here, just from and keep in mind, Ahimelech is, I'm sure, is familiar, at least at some minimums, of what's going on, right? With the various intricacies of the issues surrounding Saul and David and the challenges with all the battles and war that's going on. And so anytime something out of the ordinary occurs, there's a tendency to wonder a little bit, what's this about?
It doesn't bring it out in first part of 21 here, but later on, it brings out that basically David was seeking the Lord, wanted to seek his guidance.
Yeah.
The reason why he was there at all.
Right. Yeah, we finally get Yeah, the sense of, and again, that's not really what's at issue. That's not really why David's there. And that's kind of that, and that's part of this issue. And so here's the weird thing. Though Ahimelech may not know exactly what this is about, the truth is he has reason to be concerned, because he's basically going to be duped here in a minute by David, and into basically giving them what had been consecrated for the priests, and allowing his men to have. So though we don't get a definition of what he's afraid of exactly, he has every right to be concerned, because he's about to be deceived by David. And Ahimelech, most likely up through this point, has sided with whom? Would have sided with who? King. Yeah, okay. So if David just comes on his own, Ahimelech's not going to help David, because his allegiances are to the king still. And so it's an interesting dynamic. Yep, go ahead.
Did he know that Saul was trying to kill David? And that, would he have known that? And would that have been why he was maybe afraid?
And again, I might be making some assumptions because we don't have a verbatim thought we can look to or point to. But my conclusion is that Ahimelech would have been familiar with the conflict between David and Saul. And I don't know how that would get past the priest. That he would not be aware of the challenges and the continual pursuing that was going on in relationship between Saul and David.
Yeah, but what about the farther on in verse 22, when Ahimelech was talking to Saul, and he said, you have no better servant than David.
Yeah, he tries to defend him.
I don't think he knew.
Yeah, well, there may be. And again,
he knew, he would have looked at David and said, "You sure?"
Yeah. Well, and again, and
Saul's been trying to kill you.
Right. And my only thought, the only reason I say that there's got to be some kind of knowledge of something, or he's not afraid. If David just shows up and all is well, and Ahimelech's unaware of anything, there's zero reason for fear here. And that's the only reason I'm drawing that conclusion. That there's got to be some motivation. There's got to be some cause. If the effect is fear, there's got to be some cause to that. And that's why I draw that conclusion. So I can't point you to a verse and say this is it. But that's just a general conclusion made because there's some backdrop to why Ahimelech's afraid when David arrives. But you're right, that he does seem to be somewhat clueless when he has a conversation with Saul later about all the details of what's been going on between the two.
Brian?
Yep, go ahead, Randy.
How could he not know about that when the whole nation knows all the troops, the army, and everybody's been pursuing after David? David's been knew all about it. You're going to tell me a priest did not know about something like that? It's so well known.
Yeah, and again, so there could be some different reasonings why he says what he says to Saul later as well. Of course, he's in protect mode in that point too. But yeah, it's hard, but it's hard for me to draw any other conclusion. He'd had to at least know of all these maneuvers and things that were going on.
Well, what Randy said is true.
Well, Diane's not here to defend that, so.
But if that's true, then Ahimelech would have known that was a lie to begin with.
Well, and that's true. That's a good point. That you wonder if Ahimelech was fully familiar with the conflict between David and Saul. But I'll backtrack from that too, because there's this odd times where even though Saul hates David, he's still sending him out on his bidding at times.
Yeah.
And so there are these weird moments where Saul hates him and wants him dead, but yet is still using him as a servant. And so again, you're right. That's why I say when I come back to the idea that he's afraid, it's a pretty confused relationship between Saul and David.
He wasn't traveling incognito. He was traveling. He
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
They didn't have no media broadcast.
Yeah. There wasn't no. Yeah, there weren't any news reports going out for him. All right. Let's. Yeah. And that's what creates a scenario. Maybe that's at the end of the discussion here. That's kind of where we're at. Is his ties are to Saul, and so let's jump to question 2, and get back towards maybe a little more practical conversation. Then, how would you characterize David's statement in the second verse? And so, first let's read it. He says, "And David said unto Ahimelech the priest, The king hath commanded me a business, and hath said unto me, Let no man know anything of the business." That's why I'm by myself, right? Justifying why are you by yourself? Well, I'm by myself because the king didn't want anybody else to know about this. "Let no man know anything of the business whereabout I send thee. What I have commanded thee, I have appointed my servants to such and such a place." And so how would you characterize this?
Lord.
All right. It's not true. Okay. It's not true. Uh-huh. Oh, it's not on? My bad. I forgot that. There you go. And so and then he asked the secondary question is, why would David take this step?
He knew he wouldn't be helped.
Right. So if he wants the help, in David's mind, he has to lie. And by the way, to me, that is classic situation ethics. Right? I'm hungry. I need food. This guy won't give it to me unless I create a story that he'll buy into. And so my situation demands that I lie. And I don't know whether that's true or not. I don't know. And here's where I'm trying to figure out in my own mind, in some ways. Is David then culpable here? Is he accountable for this deception and lie? Is this part of a grander scheme of things that he's justified in because of this? That's where the conversation occurs.
You got to take it in order of how it appears here. The deception occurs before he asks for the bread.
Yeah.
And the priest says, "I don't have any ordinary bread."
Right.
So his reason for deception was not to get the bread, because the deception was made before he even asked for bread. He assumed that the priest could give him ordinary bread, which wouldn't have been any problem.
There are two issues at hand. There is the deceit that creates the scenario to begin with. And then there's the second issue is the acceptance of the showbread. That the law was very clear, only belonged to the priest. And so in some senses, there are two situations that have, one has an ethical flavor to it. Is it okay for him to lie because he's afraid he'll get an unfavorable response otherwise? And then you've got the issues of the law when it comes to the showbread itself. They're somewhat distinct, even though they're both kind of wrapped up in the same package.
The result of the lie got Ahimelech and his whole family and the whole city destroyed.
Yeah. And sometimes you sometimes to understand whether something, it's a hard way to say this, but to get a sense of whether this was a justified action, for lack of a better answer. When you look at the fruit, you begin to realize, no, David caused a bigger problem here than the fact that he and his men were hungry. His deception led to a massacre, and he's accountable for that. And so maybe there is a lesson then behind all this, that sometimes our immediate need that we perceive, and we determine that any course of action is justified because my need is greater than any consequence it may create. Was it really, David? Was the circumstance that dire that you were willing to put at risk? And I can't help but believe he has to know He knows the kind of man Saul is. Saul has dealt harshly with anybody who's tried to help David. And he's got to know that if Saul finds out that Ahimelech assisted them, then Ahimelech and anybody connected to him is going to pay the price for that. And so I think there is a lesson here that his situation, though it may have been challenged, didn't necessarily justify the deception in relationship to what David did in this circumstance. And that's why I believe and when I said at the outset of our study today that I was kind of on two paths, well, maybe more than that in some ways, but was from the deception side, the lie side, that's where the situation ethics issue comes into play. The conversation about whether they should eat the showbread or not, it was a matter of law. And you could have a different kind of discussion about violation of the Old Testament law, and David's culpability to that. Then that's where Jesus' conversation comes into it. The statements Jesus made concerning the Sabbath and that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, that conversation is about whether or not it was lawful or unlawful, appropriate, not appropriate for David and his men to eat that showbread. The first thing that occurs, though, is this situation where David lies. That's kind of why I thought in my mind that there's two distinct kinds of conversations here. One is about the law. The other is about whether David is justified in lying to Ahimelech. We know, just quickly, in all of these verses of Scripture that are listed here, and I'm going to come back to question 2, by the way, but I want to add. So basically, what's condemned in every single one of those passages? Right. So you could go through, and again, our time's short this morning, although we get a little bit of time left. But in all of these texts, there's a condemnation that comes to lying. But yet we know from biblical history that there are moments, and I can pretty much guarantee, rarely can you ask an audience, give me another example, and where you'd get all the same answers. But I can almost guarantee that if I said 1, 2, 3, go, I would hear the same name. There you go. Right? We always, when it comes to this conversation, we always run to Rahab, right? And why is that? Because she lied. Okay? But with Rahab, and this gets back to this question of list a few similar events in Bible history. Rahab is one of the most challenging to me pieces of history that to try to pull away from that situational ethics conversation. Because the truth is, I don't believe in situational ethics. I don't believe you can just manipulate what's right and wrong based on the situation that you're in. I think right is right and wrong is wrong. Right? It's black. It's more black and white than that. It's concrete. Rahab seems to always be the anomaly in that conversation, and I can find ways to help me, kind of rectify some of those conflicts with Rahab. But I don't see Rahab and David's situation, by the way, the same. I don't view them as the same. I don't see that David's circumstance matching. Rahab ends up serving the purposes of who? God. David is serving the purposes of himself and his men, right? There is a distinction between what David does here and what Rahab does. And in some senses, and then when you look at the fruits of the results, David causes a greater problem for lots of folks because of his situational lie. Rahab aids the progress of the conquest of the Promised Land by being willing to side with the Israelites in that process. But she always comes to the surface because the truth is she didn't tell those folks the truth concerning where those spies were. And yet she ultimately is rewarded for her aid to those men, and her family spared in that destruction of Jericho.
I don't think we should ascribe to David that he is the cause for the priests being killed. I mean, what he did was to save the lives of these men. Just like Jesus and his disciples, when they was going through the field of grain, eating the heads of grain, and Jesus justified David in that chapter there, chapter 12, for what they did as compared to what David did for his men to save lives.
Yeah.
The law is justifying there that, in order to save lives, that he's innocent. So you can't blame a person who is innocent by the law there for the cause of somebody else being killed.
And you may be right, Bob. But that's why I said I believe there are two distinct things happening here. Jesus never talks about David lying about why he was there. Jesus never addresses that. He only addresses whether it was okay for David to eat that showbread or not. That's why I think you've got two separate conversations to have. That's why my conclusion is that I do feel David owns some responsibility here. And especially by the fact that he has to know that if Saul finds out what happens here, he's put more than just his own men at jeopardy. And anyway, I mean that's just why I concluded that, I guess.
Another person, the situation is Abraham and Sarah.
Okay. And so that we generally would run to Rahab first, but we also remember an account where Abraham told what we would call what? Well, we'd call it this, right? We'd call it a half lie because when he said Sarah's my sister, she is his half sister, okay? But the problem was that's not really the full disclosure that Pharaoh needed, if you will. Now, Pharaoh isn't necessarily, it wasn't a great fella necessarily, but Abraham created a greater problem. That God had to create some circumstances in opposition to the Pharaoh of that day in order to get Sarah and Abraham out of there. But again, fear, there's all kinds of reasons why people may look at a situation. And really, the bleaker the situation, sometimes the more willing people are to accept the deceits or lies or whatever people need to do. I heard a funny story a long time ago about a fellow that stole a pack of mules to be able to plow his field to feed his family. Everybody knew that's why he stole them, and so they charge him. He goes to court, and the judge says, "I find the man innocent, and he can give the mules back." So how can a man be innocent of stealing or find him guilty rather? He's guilty of stealing, but whatever. Let's move on. That made sense in my head 30 seconds ago. I'll edit that out later. Nobody even know I said that. All right, but you understand what I mean. Sometimes people are guilty of certain things, but the situation they were in, we try to justify thievery, or we justify lying, or we justify in that situational ethics. Go ahead, Brian. Go ahead. He's pointing back to you, so you go ahead and I'll come back to you.
I mean, could this be a case of the end justify the means?
Yeah.
Basically.
And I think that's a challenge we have sometimes. We see this end result that we're aiming for, and sometimes we see that purpose as being greater than any misbehavior that we might have to fulfill to lead up to it. But the ends don't always justify the means, and we have to be very cautious about that. Go ahead.
When false prophets work, they just give them part of the truth.
Yeah.
For a lie will work, that's what they'll use.
Yeah. And the challenge of all this is that, and again, with the exception of Rahab, because she again is the kind of the anomaly in all this. But David's deception didn't go without some consequence. Bad things happened because he didn't tell the truth. Abraham, bad things happened because he looked at the situation as being okay to tell half the truth. Bad things happen. Sometimes we convince ourselves that our situation justifies certain means by which to find a result. But a lot of times those choices come back to haunt us. And they come back to challenge us even in greater ways than we experienced before. Go ahead.
It's a place where we should show mercy instead of, go right down the law.
Yeah.
Jesus said something about he'd rather have mercy than sacrifice.
Yeah. And that's an important aspect of well, that's a deeper conversation we can have in 8 minutes. But where God tries to emphasize to us to not just know the law, but to understand the law. Understand why did God institute the Sabbath day? Why did God put this law or this practice or this purpose in motion? And look at the context in which those things are taught and shared. Look at the history of people practicing those things and begin to get a deeper appreciation of why God put His law in place. And I think that was one of the great flaws, especially by the time you get to the Jews in the days of Jesus, was that they had become very ritualistic and would fulfill certain very specific aspects of that law, but it had no real connection to it and no real understanding of why God had instituted. And that can happen with us with the law of Christ as well. We can begin to view the law of Christ as just, here are the things that I must do, here are the things I can't do, here are the things that are bad, here are the things that are good. And we never spend any time trying to learn and appreciate why did Jesus teach that? Why did He establish this principle or this aspect of His law? And I think we gain a better appreciation if we'd spend some time doing that.
Can that be a sign of weakness in a man? We're afraid that the truth is what the consequences are going to be.
Yeah, generally, to me, most of it, you can look at several, but fear is one of the things that motivates men to look at situational ethics. But there's all kinds of, and there could be other motivations as well. So, back in the narrative, if you recall, Ahimelech makes this decision that as long as the men haven't been around any women for a while, then this will be okay. And he said, verse 4, the priest answered David and said, there is no common bread under mine hand, but there is hallowed bread, if the young men have kept themselves at least from women. And David answered the priest and said unto him, of a truth, women have been kept from us about these 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy. The bread is in a manner common, yea, though it were sanctified this day in the vessel. So the priest gave him hallowed bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread that was taken from before the Lord to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. So as they would refresh that, then they would take the old away, and then they could use that. Priest could, but he allows for David, and we've already discussed that in part. Run to chapter 22. Apologizing, I'm speed reading a little bit here as we're. And in this description here in verses 9 and 10, there's another situation. Answered Doeg the Edomite, which was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub, and he inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him victuals, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. So this is when what? Who's finding out about this?
Saul.
This is when Saul's finding out, I believe, when all of these events took place. And so Ahimelech decides that if they're pure, he makes a choice that it's okay for them to go ahead, even though the law was very specific in relationship to it. For time's sake, let's move forward. Question 5 said, what did the disciples of Christ do that bore some similarity to this event? And we've already kind of talked about this. But that was the scene in Matthew 12 where they... Yeah, and the Pharisee said, you've broken the law of the Sabbath. And the basic law of the Sabbath that they're calling attention to is what? You're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. Although that, Jesus illustrated in different occasions where they really had kind of a misconception even about what that meant. Because even he said, even you, if a fellow's, I believe he said, if his donkey fell in a ditch, you would still go out and what? You'd still go out and help him get it out of the ditch if it was on it. So you understand. He points out to them, you already grasped the concept. That the idea here is it's a day of rest. It doesn't mean you cannot physically do anything. But the concept is it was a day of rest. And yet that was the accusation. And so again, Jesus' circumstance there, though, is different than David lying to Ahimelech, because Jesus didn't neither lie nor did he really violate the Sabbath. And so there is a distinction between the two. And of course, Jesus' understanding of that Old Testament Sabbath law obviously was greater than theirs. Let's look at these two comments that he makes. One in verse 7 of Matthew 12. And again, we've already, in kind of our summary approach to some of these conversations. But Ed mentioned this a moment ago. But if you had known what this meaneth, if you'd spent some time trying to understand these things, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. Are there times where two different aspects of what God desires, for lack of a better description, may be put in conflict with one another? And I think the answer to that is yes. That there are times where we have to reason and come to an understanding of what God is looking for lack of a better way to say it, first. And this description, he basically outlines here which of these two things comes first, mercy or sacrifice. Mercy. Doesn't mean sacrifice is inconsequential. It doesn't mean sacrifice isn't part of the law. It doesn't mean that sacrifice is unnecessary. He simply says that sometimes when you have to examine the law, you have to make some reasonable conclusions of in what order you fulfill it. And if you're at conflict of whether is this a moment for mercy or is this a moment for sacrifice, Jesus says, let mercy go first. And so I think sometimes we think of it as situational ethics when we have to make some of those kinds of decisions. But I don't believe that to be the case. I believe really what we're required to do is simply understand from Scripture which one takes precedent in the moment. Which aspect of God's will is the primary in that conversation, and make the best decisions we can in relationship to that.
This is one of the problems that got Saul in trouble to begin with.
Yeah.
I think the king, he didn't take care
Yeah.
of the whole thing.
Right.
Yep.
When you brought up 1, 2, and 9 and 10, there's a very important part of that. Where it says, when Noah is telling Saul about the situation, it said Ahimelech inquired of God for David.
Yeah.
So obviously God has approved what happened there in the first part of 21.
I'll have to think on that.
You ever heard the story about a person who was on his way to the services and someone's car was broke down, but they couldn't help that person because they were on their way to services?
Yeah.
And that's a perfect example.
Yeah, and you're right, Kim. And I wish we'd had more time. Maybe we'll come back to this a little bit Wednesday because it's Wednesday's a review, by the way. If you knew it's less than 13, but so we'll get a chance to come back to that. But you're right. I think sometimes we've got these imageries of, and we sometimes don't really know or we don't do as good a job as we could of knowing which priority needs to be put in place.